Now and then I like to dig out stories from the Ringway Manchester vault that you've hopefully never heard before relating to the darker side of amateur radio and scanning. In this instalment I've pulled together some long lost stories that you won't find on the internet that have otherwise been lost to time, which involve unusual instances relating to police radio systems. I've covered some of the things that happened to those caught listening to the police in the past, but what about those who interfered with them instead? Two radio enthusiasts were fined by Sunderland magistrates for breaking wireless telegraphy laws back in 1990 for a reason I find extremely nasty on the part of the law. A man called Lawrence, aged 32, of High Barn, Sunderland, admitted 2 offences of using apparatus without a wireless telegraphy licence and 1 of unlawful use of apparatus. His friend George, aged 40, of Seaham, admitted using apparatus without a licence and aiding and abetting Lawrence. Both men were fined £50 for each of the offences they committed and ordered to pay £50 in costs. This is fair enough, there's a radio licence system in place for a reason. The story didn't end there, however. William Temperley, prosecuting for the Department of Trade and Industry, which governed wireless telegraphy in the UK at that time, said George had received information about local police radio frequencies over the air. The allegation was that Lawrence had been heard supplying this information to George, who then used it to listen to the frequencies, quote, breaking the terms of his licence. Now, the original case notes claim that neither had a licence, so I'm not sure what terms they could actually breach. The law that they were breaking was the "you can't listen to anything not intended for you" law. Richard Langdon, defending, said George asked for interesting frequencies only and there was no ulterior motive. Lawrence, he added, breached the licence, again what licence, because the information he sent was not personal or technical. He would not have been committing an offence if he had sent it by post or fax, said Mr. Langdon. The law has always been clear on what can and can't be spoken about on the amateur radio bands, although these days it's largely ignored. It appears that the DTI wanted another nail for George and Lawrence's coffin and waited for them to trip themselves up by discussing police frequencies. Police radio operators were sent filthy sexual-oriented messages by a Newport amateur radio ham we'll call Robert back in early 1994. As a result, police and DTI officers who traced the signals raided his home. The 36-year-old admitted illegal use of radio equipment and sending false messages. Charges of interfering with wireless telegraphy and using wireless apparatus with intent to obtain information were withdrawn. Newport magistrates heard that female radio operators at Gwent Police HQ received obscene messages. The case was adjourned for reports and Robert was granted unconditional bail. The outcome of the case isn't clear. Police officers in Eastbourne heard whistling and at one time a series of distorted intermittent signals on their radios back in November 1977. GPO technicians then took out their mobile equipment and traced the transmissions to a residential street. They obtained police assistance and went into the premises, and upon entering, they saw various items of equipment laid out upstairs. The equipment belonged to an 18-year-old we'll call Ian. The young radio enthusiast who set up a station in his bedroom ran into trouble when his illicit transmissions were picked up and tracked by the post office technicians. He was fined £25 for using a station for wireless telegraphy without a licence after he pleaded not guilty. Mr. Anthony Brentnall, prosecuting on behalf of the post office, said that technical officers investigating radio interference monitored the transmissions and found them to be of a peculiar sort. Ian said, "I was trying to rectify some faults in the transmitter and receiver. I was only transmitting into a light bulb, which is quite legal. I was testing it by counting to 10 and whistling." He said he had the equipment in his room for preparation for an amateur radio exam he was taking. Ian, I know you're probably watching this, so I'll keep an eye on WhatsApp for your reaction. Police Chief Chris Ferber settled down to watch TV in early 1994, only to hear his radio ham neighbour Keith chattering away. This led to a war between neighbours. The superintendent, who was head of Hereford Police, asked councillors to block a plan by Keith to put up a new mast for his radio hobby. Ferber said his TV picture already suffered from interference, and sometimes he'd hear voice transmissions coming out of the set and through his own radio. That the interference is caused by Keith is accepted, he said. I recognise his voice on the transmissions, and his wife has listened to the transmissions coming through my television set while he transmits next door. He said he even bought a new TV to try to counter Keith's transmissions, but without success. Department of Trade and Industry officers visited Keith's home and gave his radio equipment a clean bill of health. There were no spurious transmissions or harmonics to be found. Keith claimed that Ferber had a powerful amplifier connected to his set that was dragging in interference. Keith applied to Hereford Council for permission to put up a new £800 mast, which would rise 17 feet above his detached home next to Ferber's. The police chief wrote to the council saying he sympathised with Keith's circumstances, but feared the Radio Ham's plans could devalue homes on the estate. He asked council chiefs if they would buy a new home near one that looked like a satellite radio station for Radio Wyvern, the local commercial radio station. Keith told the council the sophisticated new mast would cut interference. Architect Paul Sant said radio was his main contact with the outside world. He added that Keith had chosen an unobtrusive spot for his mast so it wouldn't annoy neighbours. The outcome of this story is unclear, so Keith, if you're watching this, I know you still operate, so I'd love to hear from you. Interference on radios operated by the Regional Crime Squad was traced to a boat operator living in Tolverne on the River Fowl back in 1987. In the early part of the summer, the Regional Crime Squad, using a radio channel allocated to them, discovered they weren't the only ones using it. As a result, radio investigation officers attempted to trace where the other signals were coming from. In June and July, the officer was able to monitor the signals and eventually trace them to the home of a man we'll call Anthony, who was 43 at the time. He operated a passenger vessel named Heather. Armed with a search warrant and accompanied by police, a DTI officer went to Anthony's home and found a transceiver in the kitchen. One of the channels on it had been amended so it could broadcast on the Crime Squad channel. Another set was found in the Heather and a third in another vessel. Both of them had been amended to transmit on this new frequency. Anthony admitted using apparatus for wireless telegraphy designed or adapted for a mission other than in accordance with a license. Mr. Robin Roebuck, defending, said he had pleaded guilty because ignorance of the law was no excuse. He committed the offence without a guilty mind and never thought he was doing anything illegal or wrong. The transceiver on the Heather, bought to replace another vessel, became faulty, and a technician at Falmouth said he could provide a channel for private conversations. Because they were carrying out work for laid-up ships, there could be information they wouldn't want others knowing. It was thought that having a private channel would be a good idea, said Mr. Roebuck. The channel was outside the prescribed range and just outside the allowed frequency allocation for marine traffic. The radios were worth around £1,000, and Mr. Roebuck asked the court to decide that they should not be forfeited so that they could be modified to work legally. Anthony was fined £100, and the court ordered that the equipment should be forfeited. A court heard how a 24-year-old man who stole a £340 police radio used it to broadcast fake messages in December 1983. The man, who we'll call Alan, appeared before Reading magistrates on December 19, 1993 and admitted stealing the radio. On one occasion, the radio was used to make bogus calls for help, and officers were sent to deal with the hoax incident. Anthony Cranfield, prosecuting, said the officer with the radio concerned was on patrol on the evening of November 3rd. He went to an incident in London Street and used the radio to contact the control room. When he got to his next job, he realised it was missing. Shortly afterwards, the control room at the police station started receiving calls from an unknown source. On one occasion, the caller said he was a police officer and wanted assistance in London Road. Officers were sent there, but there was no incident. Cranfield said that the fake calls continued to be made that day and the next. Enquiries were made, and Alan was questioned at his home on November 9th. He at first denied any knowledge of the radio, but was arrested on suspicion of stealing it. He later admitted he found it laying on the ground in London Road. He said he gave it to a friend and took police to a house where the radio was recovered. Alan said he realised it was a police radio and admitted using it and listening to messages. He said he used it again after learning some police lingo. He apologised for what he'd done. It was pointed out to me how dangerous it was if the radio got into the wrong hands, he said. Cranfield said the implications of what he was doing were in fact serious and could have led to distress and difficulty. Janetta David, defending, said that Alan was exceedingly sorry for what he did, but added, "This really is theft by finding." The magistrates fined Alan £50. Do you remember any of these stories? If you know the people involved, please don't mention their full names. I've left them out to protect their privacy. I'm sure that during the decades that have passed since these incidents, they've grown up and would rather forget them. If any of you are watching, feel free to get in touch.